Autumn's cold embrace. When a brutal winter storm left Lady Isabel of Wessex stranded, she sought shelter in the stronghold of Sir Gareth of Northwick, a man more myth than man. He stood in the firelight, watching her carefully. "No one comes here by accident," he murmured. "Tell me, my lady, what are you running from?" Chapter 1. The Unexpected Storm. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at Lady Isabel's cloak as she urged her mare, Willow, onward. Snow, thick and relentless, had been falling since midday, turning the familiar Wessex countryside into a treacherous, blinding expanse. The once clear path to her cousin, Lady Alara's, estate was now lost beneath a blanket of white, each gust of wind a cruel hand pushing her further off course. Isabel shivered, pulling the fur-lined hood tighter around her face, the icy tendrils of the storm creeping through even the thickest wool. She had been warned. Her steward, old Thomas, with his perpetually worried frown, had pleaded with her to delay her journey. "The weather turns foul, my lady," he'd said, his voice rough with concern. "A storm brews in the north, the likes of which we haven't seen in years." But Isabel, stubborn and driven by a desperate need to escape the stifling confines of her own castle, had dismissed his concerns. Now, hours later, with the light fading and the storm showing no sign of abating, she regretted her impetuousness. Willow stumbled, her breath clouding the frigid air. Isabel patted the mare's neck, murmuring soothing words, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She was no stranger to hardship. The loss of her husband, Lord Edmund, 2 years prior, had left a gaping hole in her life, a wound that refused to heal. The subsequent power struggles within her own household, the constant vying for influence by her late husband's ambitious brother, Lord Alaric, had made her life a suffocating web of intrigue and suspicion. This journey, this escape to Alara's, was meant to be a respite, a chance to breathe, to find some semblance of peace. But the storm seemed determined to deny her even that small solace. A sudden, violent gust of wind nearly ripped the reins from her grasp. Willow reared, whinnying in terror, and Isabel fought to maintain control. The landscape was a blur of white, the trees' skeletal figures looming out of the swirling snow. She had no idea where she was, no sense of direction, only the bone-chilling certainty that if she didn't find shelter soon, she and Willow would perish. Then, through the blinding curtain of snow, she saw it. A faint, flickering light, a beacon in the overwhelming whiteness. Hope, fragile but tenacious, surged through her. Urging Willow forward, she battled her way towards the light, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate anticipation. As she drew closer, the light resolved itself into the warm glow emanating from the windows of a massive structure. A stronghold, built of dark, imposing stone, rose out of the swirling snow, its battlements barely visible against the stormy sky. It was a place of stark, formidable beauty, a fortress against the elements, a refuge in the heart of the storm. Northwick. The name whispered through her mind, a name she had only heard in hushed tones, a place shrouded in legend and rumor. The seat of Sir Gareth, the winter knight, a man as enigmatic and formidable as the stronghold he commanded. A warrior of renowned skill and unflinching loyalty, yet one who kept himself aloof from the courtly intrigues of Wessex, a recluse in his own domain. Isabel had never met him, had only heard the tales of his bravery in battle, his unwavering sense of honor, his solitude. He was said to be a man haunted by a past tragedy, a man who had retreated from the world, seeking solace in the isolation of Northwick. As she reached the gates, massive wooden structures reinforced with iron, she hesitated. The stories painted a picture of a man who valued his privacy, a man who might not welcome an unexpected guest, especially a woman, alone and unannounced. But the alternative to face the storm again was unthinkable. Taking a deep breath, she dismounted, her legs stiff and aching from the cold. She led Willow to the gate and reached for the heavy iron ring, her gloved hand trembling. The sound of the knocker echoed through the courtyard, swallowed by the wind's roar. Moments stretched into an eternity. Isabel stood there, the snow piling up around her, her hope dwindling with each passing second. Just as she was about to turn away, defeated, she heard the sound of heavy bolts being drawn back. The gate creaked open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from within. He was tall, even taller than she had imagined, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He wore a dark tunic and breeches, a heavy cloak thrown over his shoulders, his face obscured by the shadows of the hood. But even in the dim light, she could sense the power that emanated from him, the aura of strength and command that surrounded him like a tangible force. Who seeks entry to Northwick? His voice was deep, resonant, a voice that carried the weight of authority and a hint of weariness. Isabel swallowed, her throat dry. "I am Lady Isabel of Wessex," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I was caught in the storm. I seek shelter." The figure remained motionless for a moment, his silence adding to the tension. Then, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in, my lady. You are welcome to Northwick's hospitality." As she led Willow through the gate, into the relative warmth of the courtyard, the figure closed the gate behind them, the sound of the bolts sliding home echoing like a final, irrevocable decision. The courtyard was large, paved with stone, and surprisingly sheltered from the wind. Stables lined one side, and she could hear the muffled sounds of horses within. A few figures, clad in the dark livery of Northwick, moved about, their faces curious but respectful. The man who had admitted her led her towards the main entrance of the stronghold, a massive oak door studded with iron. As they approached, the door swung open, revealing a brightly lit hall, filled with the warmth of a roaring fire and the murmur of voices. He removed his hood, and Isabel finally saw his face. It was a face that was both striking and unsettling. Strong, angular features, a jawline shadowed by a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that were the color of the winter sky, piercing and intense, holding a depth of sadness that made her breath catch in her throat. He had the look of a man who had seen too much, suffered too much, a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Scars, faint but visible, traced a path across his left cheek and brow, silent testament to battles fought and wounds endured. He stood in the firelight, watching her carefully. "No one comes here by accident," he murmured. "Tell me, my lady, what are you running from?" His words, though softly spoken, struck her like a physical blow. They pierced through her carefully constructed facade, exposing the raw vulnerability she had tried so hard to conceal. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, the truth of his words a bitter taste in her mouth. She was running from the suffocating expectations of her court, from the constant threat of Alaric's ambition, from the ghosts of her past. But how could she explain that to this man, this stranger, this knight of legend? How could she possibly reveal that she was truly fleeing the emptiness of her life? Chapter 2. Sanctuary of Shadows. The Great Hall of Northwick was a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. Massive timbers, blackened by age and smoke, formed the vaulted ceiling, supported by thick stone pillars. A huge fireplace dominated one end of the hall, a roaring fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating tapestries depicting scenes of battles and hunts. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and beeswax candles. Long tables, crafted from heavy oak, filled the center of the hall, surrounded by benches and a few high-backed chairs. Several men, all clad in the dark, unadorned livery of Northwick, were seated at the tables, eating and talking in low voices. They turned to look as Sir Gareth and Isabel entered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. There was a quiet, disciplined air about them, a sense of loyalty and respect that spoke volumes about the man who commanded them. Gareth led Isabel towards the fire, his hand hovering near her elbow, a gesture of polite guidance rather than any intimate contact. "You are chilled, my lady," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection that might betray his thoughts. "Warm yourself. Alara will see to your comfort." Isabel nodded, grateful for the warmth that seeped into her frozen limbs. She glanced around, searching for a female presence, and saw a woman approaching them, her movements graceful and efficient. Alara, though not bearing a striking resemblance to Gareth, shared his serious demeanor and the same piercing, intelligent eyes, though hers were a softer shade of gray. She was dressed in a simple, but well-made gown of dark blue wool, her hair, the color of dark honey, braided and coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. "Gareth," Alara said, her voice calm and measured. "A guest in such weather? This is unexpected." "Lady Isabel of Wessex," Gareth said, introducing them. "She was caught in the storm and seeks shelter." Alara's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she regained her composure. "Of course," she said, turning to Isabel with a polite curtsy. "Welcome to Northwick, my lady. I am Alara, Sir Gareth's sister. We are honored by your presence." Isabel returned the curtsy, relieved by Alara's courteous reception. "Thank you," she said. "I am grateful for your kindness. I fear I have imposed upon you." "Nonsense," Alara said, her tone reassuring. "Northwick is always open to those in need. Come, let us find you dry clothes and a warm meal. You must be exhausted." Alara led Isabel away from the fire, towards a smaller, more private chamber adjacent to the great hall. Gareth watched them go, his expression unreadable, his eyes following Isabel until she disappeared from view. He then turned to the men seated at the tables, his gaze sweeping over them. "Continue your meal," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And remember, Lady Isabel is our guest. She is to be treated with the utmost respect and courtesy." The men nodded, returning to their food and conversation, but the air of curiosity remained. Gareth's words, though simple, carried the weight of a command, a reminder of the strict code of conduct that governed life at Northwick. Meanwhile, in the smaller chamber, Alara was helping Isabel out of her wet clothes. The room was comfortably furnished, with a smaller fireplace, a large bed draped with heavy curtains, and a few chests and chairs. A serving woman, young and shy, brought in a basin of warm water and towels. "We are not accustomed to receiving such noble guests," Alara said, as she handed Isabel a dry linen shift. "But we will do our best to make you comfortable." "You are very kind," Isabel said, gratefully accepting the shift. She washed her face and hands, the warm water a welcome relief against her chilled skin. "I apologize for this intrusion. I had no intention of troubling you." Alara smiled faintly. "It is no trouble, my lady. The storm is fierce, and Northwick is built to withstand much worse. You are safe here." "Safe." The word resonated with Isabel, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She looked around the chamber, at the solid stone walls, the warm fire, the simple but comfortable furnishings. It was a haven, a place of refuge from the storm, both outside and within. As Alara helped her into a dry gown, a simple but elegant garment of dark green wool, Isabel couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She was a stranger in this place, a guest in the home of a man she knew only by reputation, a man shrouded in mystery and rumor. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability, of the precariousness of her situation. "Tell me, my lady," Alara said, her voice gentle but probing, "what brings you so far north in such weather? Your journey must have been urgent." Isabel hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She couldn't speak of Alaric's threats, of her fear for her own safety. She couldn't betray the secrets of her household, the web of intrigue that had driven her to flee. "I was traveling to visit my cousin, Lady Alara of Lidford," she said, choosing her words carefully. "She is expecting me." A small lie, woven to protect a larger truth. Alara nodded, seemingly accepting her explanation. "Lidford is a considerable distance," she said. "It is fortunate you found Northwick. The storm would have made further travel impossible." Isabel agreed, a wave of relief washing over her. She was safe for now. But the question that Gareth had asked her earlier echoed in her mind. "What are you running from?" She knew that she couldn't hide the truth forever. Sooner or later, The shadows of her past would catch up with her, even in this remote sanctuary. The weight of her secrets, the burden of her fears, settled upon her once more, a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. The storm had brought her to Northwick, but it had also brought her closer to the reckoning she had been trying to escape. Chapter 3. The Night of Northwick. After a simple but nourishing meal of roasted venison, bread, and cheese, served in the smaller chamber with Alara, Isabel felt her strength returning. The warmth of the fire and the dry clothes had chased away the lingering chill, and the exhaustion that had weighed her down began to ease. Alara, though reserved, had proven to be a gracious and attentive hostess, anticipating Isabel's needs and offering quiet conversation. "My brother can be intimidating," Alara said, a small smile playing on her lips as she poured Isabel a cup of warmed wine. "But he is a good man, with a strong sense of honor. He takes his responsibilities seriously." Isabel nodded, sipping the wine, the warmth spreading through her. "He seems distant," she ventured, carefully choosing her words. Alara's smile faded slightly. "Gareth carries many burdens," she said, her voice low. "The past has left its mark on him. He is not one for idle chatter or courtly games. He prefers solitude." Isabel understood, perhaps more than Alara realized. She too carried burdens, secrets that weighed heavily on her soul. She too had sought solitude, a refuge from the pain and the pressures of her life. "He asked me what I was running from," Isabel said, her voice barely a whisper. Alara met her gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "He has a way of seeing through facades," she said. "He senses things that others miss. It is a gift and a curse." Isabel looked down at her hands, twisting the silver ring on her finger, a ring that had belonged to Edmund. I am not sure I can answer that question," she confessed. "You are not obliged to," Alara said gently. "Northwick offers sanctuary, without judgment. You're safe here, my lady. That is all that matters." But Isabel knew that safety was a fragile illusion. Her past was a shadow that followed her, a threat that lingered just beyond the walls of Northwick. And Gareth, with his piercing gaze and his unsettling ability to see through her defenses, represented both a potential refuge and a potential threat. Later that evening, after Alara had shown her to a comfortable chamber prepared for her, Isabel found herself unable to sleep. The storm still raged outside, the wind howling around the towers of Northwick, but it was the turmoil within her that kept her awake. She tossed and turned in the large bed, the heavy furs providing little comfort. Finally, she rose and walked to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains. The snow was still falling, a swirling white curtain that obscured the landscape. But through a break in the clouds, she caught a glimpse of the moon, a pale sliver of light in the vast darkness. She thought of Gareth, of the sadness she had seen in his eyes, of the unspoken burdens he carried. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him into the man he was. She felt a strange connection to him, a sense of shared sorrow, a recognition of the pain that could be hidden beneath a stoic exterior. A sound behind her made her turn. Gareth stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the corridor. He wore a long, dark robe over his nightclothes, his hair unbound and falling around his shoulders, making him look even more imposing. "I could not sleep," he said, his voice low and resonant. "The storm it reminds me of," he trailed off, his gaze shifting to the window, to the storm raging outside. Isabel understood. The storm was a reminder of the chaos, the unpredictability, the powerlessness that they had both experienced. "It is a fierce storm," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the swirling snow. "It will pass," he said, more to himself than to her. "They always do." He turned back to her, his gaze meeting hers. The intensity in his eyes was unnerving, but there was also a vulnerability there, a hint of the pain he kept hidden. "You are troubled, my lady," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see it in your eyes." Isabel felt a tremor of fear, but also a strange sense of relief. He saw her, truly saw her, not just the facade she presented to the world. "We all carry our burdens, Sir Gareth," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small chamber. Some burdens are heavier than others, he said. And some are best shared. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver through her, a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. A connection, a recognition, a flicker of hope in the darkness. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared burdens, with the dangerous allure of a connection forged in the heart of a storm. He didn't press further. He withdrew his hand. "Rest, my lady," he says softly, all traces of that moment gone from his face, leaving only the stoic night. Tomorrow is a new day. Then, without a backward glance, he departs, leaving Isabel alone, to battle her own storm. The hope that flared in her breast has been tamped, but the embers still glow. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. A thick blanket of snow covered everything, glistening in the bright sunlight, the landscape pristine and untouched. The air was crisp and invigorating, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Isabel awoke feeling refreshed, despite her restless night. The chamber was warm, the fire having been replenished during the night, and a serving woman had already brought in a basin of warm water and a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and fruit. After dressing in the same dark green gown she had worn the previous day, her own clothes still being dried, Isabel ventured out of her chamber, eager to explore Northwick and perhaps learn more about her enigmatic host. She found Alara in the great hall, overseeing the morning's activities. The hall was bustling with activity, servants cleaning and preparing for the day, men at arms going about their duties, the air filled with the sounds of everyday life. "Good morning, my lady," Alara greeted her, a polite smile on her face. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, thank you," Isabel replied. "The storm has passed, it seems." "Indeed," Alara said. "Northwick has weathered many storms. It is built to withstand the harshest conditions." Isabel glanced around the hall, admiring the sturdy construction, the sense of strength and resilience that permeated the very stones. "It is a remarkable place," she said. "It is our home," Alara said simply. "And for now, it is yours as well." Isabel smiled, grateful for Alara's continued hospitality. "I am eager to see more of it," she said, "and perhaps to learn more about its history." Alara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I would be happy to show you around," she said. "But first, perhaps you would like to join my brother for a walk in the courtyard? He often takes the air there in the mornings." Isabel's heart quickened slightly at the mention of Gareth. She was both intrigued and apprehensive about seeing him again after their encounter the previous night. But she couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him, the strange connection that had sparked between them. "Yes," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I would like that." Alara led her out of the hall, through a series of corridors and passageways, until they reached a large, enclosed courtyard. The courtyard was covered in snow, but a path had been cleared, leading around the perimeter. And there, standing near a stone fountain, its water frozen into a glittering sculpture, was Gareth. He was dressed in a dark tunic and breeches, a heavy cloak thrown over his shoulders, his sword strapped to his side. He was looking out over the snow-covered landscape, his expression contemplative, his posture radiating a quiet strength. As they approached, he turned, his eyes meeting Isabel's. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, recognition, perhaps, or a hint of the connection they had shared the previous night. But his expression quickly returned to its usual stoic mask. "Good morning, my lady," he said, his voice formal. "I trust you are recovered from your ordeal?" "Yes, thank you," Isabel replied. "Your sister has been most kind." He nodded, acknowledging Alara with a brief glance. "Alara is the heart of Northwick," he said. "She keeps everything running smoothly." Alara smiled, a genuine smile that softened her features. "My brother exaggerates," she said, "but I do my best." "And your best is formidable," Gareth said, a hint of warmth in his voice. He then turned back to Isabel. "Would you care to walk with me, my lady? The air is fresh, and the view is inspiring." Isabel hesitated for only a moment before accepting. They began to walk along the cleared path, Gareth setting a slow, deliberate pace. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was filled with unspoken questions, with the weight of their individual pasts. "Northwick is old," Gareth said, breaking the silence. "It has stood here for centuries, a witness to many events, both good and bad." "It feels ancient," Isabel said, looking up at the towering walls, the battlements that still bore the marks of past sieges. "It is," Gareth said. "It was built by my ancestors long before the current dynasty came to power. It has been in my family for generations." "And you are its guardian," Isabel said, choosing her words carefully. He nodded. "I am," he said. "It is my duty, my responsibility. It is in my blood." Isabel sensed the weight of that responsibility, the burden he carried as the Lord of Northwick, the protector of its people, the keeper of its secrets. "Your sister mentioned that the past has left its mark on you," she ventured, her voice hesitant. Gareth stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. The sunlight glinted off the faint scars on his cheek, reminders of a past he seemed reluctant to share. "The past is always with us, my lady," he said, his voice low. "It shapes who we are, it influences our choices. It can be a source of strength or a source of pain. Or both," Isabel added softly, thinking of her own past, of the loss of Edmund, of the threats that still haunted her. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense, as if he were trying to see into her soul. "You understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Isabel nodded, unable to speak. She did understand. She understood the pain of loss, the burden of secrets, the longing for peace. And in that moment, standing there in the snow-covered courtyard of Northwick, she felt a deeper connection to this enigmatic night, a bond forged not just by the storm, but by the shared weight of their pasts. The whispers of those pasts seemed to swirl around them, carried on the crisp winter air. A reminder of the shadows they both carried, and the possibility of finding solace in each other's presence. Chapter 5. The Price of Refuge. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Isabel spent her time exploring Northwick, learning its routines, and gradually becoming acquainted with its inhabitants. She helped Alara with household tasks, spent hours in the library, poring over ancient texts, and even ventured out into the surrounding countryside, accompanied by a small escort of Gareth's men. The landscape was breathtaking, a stark, wild beauty that both intimidated and captivated her. Snow-covered hills rolled towards the horizon, punctuated by dark forests of pine and fir. The air was clean and cold, the silence broken only by the calls of ravens and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. Gareth remained a somewhat distant figure, often preoccupied with the affairs of his domain. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a just and fair lord, respected and even loved by his people. Isabel witnessed him settling disputes, overseeing the training of his men, and planning for the long winter months ahead. He was a leader, a protector, a man who took his responsibilities seriously. But beneath his stoic exterior, Isabel sensed a deep well of loneliness, a sadness that he kept carefully guarded. She saw it in his eyes, in the fleeting moments when his guard was down, in the way he would sometimes stand alone, gazing out at the vast, unforgiving landscape. Their conversations were infrequent, but meaningful. They spoke of the history of Northwick, of the challenges of ruling a remote domain, of the importance of loyalty and duty. They avoided personal topics, circling around the edges of their pasts, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a growing sense of trust. One evening, after a shared meal in the great hall, a meal that was surprisingly convivial, filled with laughter and storytelling from Gareth's men, Isabel found herself alone with Gareth in the library. The room was dimly lit by candles, the air filled with the scent of old books and leather. Gareth was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. Isabel approached him, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. It is beautiful, she said, her voice soft. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. It is, he agreed. But it can also be cruel. This land demands respect. Isabel nodded, understanding the harsh realities of life in this remote region. You have built a strong community here, she said. Your people are loyal to you. Loyalty is earned, not given, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of bitterness. And it can be easily lost. Isabel sensed a deeper meaning in his words, a reference to a past betrayal, a wound that had not fully healed. Have you been betrayed, Sir Gareth? She asked, her voice hesitant. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense. We have all been betrayed, in one way or another, my lady, he said. It is the price of living in this world. He turned away from the window and walked towards a table where a chessboard was set up. He picked up one of the pieces, a knight, carved from dark wood. This game, he said, turning the piece over in his fingers, is a reflection of life. There are rules, strategies, sacrifices. And there are always consequences. Isabel watched him, fascinated by his words, by the way he seemed to be speaking not just about the game, but about his own life. What is the greatest sacrifice, do you think? She asked. He looked up at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. The greatest sacrifice, he said, is to give up something you love for something you believe in. His words resonated with Isabel, striking a chord deep within her. She thought of her own sacrifices, of the life she had left behind, of the choices she had made. And what do you believe in, Sir Gareth? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. I believe in duty, he said. In honor. In protecting those who cannot protect themselves. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of conviction, the strength of a man who had dedicated his life to a higher purpose. And what about love? Isabel asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. A flicker of pain crossed his face, a shadow of a past heartbreak. Love is a luxury, he said, his voice low. One that a man in my position cannot always afford. He set the knight back on the chessboard, his hand lingering on the piece. Refuge comes with a price, my lady, he said. Northwick offers you shelter, protection. But it also demands discretion. Your past, your secrets, they must remain here. They cannot follow you beyond these walls. Isabel understood. He was offering her a sanctuary, a place to heal, to rebuild. But it was a sanctuary built on silence, on the unspoken agreement that she would not bring her troubles, her enemies, into his domain. It was a price she was willing to pay. For now. She looks to him. I understand. And I give you my word. Chapter 6. A Feast of Secrets. Several weeks into her stay at Northwick, as the winter deepened and the days grew shorter, a messenger arrived, bearing a sealed letter for Gareth. Isabel, who was in the great hall with Alara, helping to sort through a delivery of winter provisions, noticed the change in Gareth's demeanor as he read the letter. His expression, usually stoic, hardened, his eyes narrowing with concern. Alara, sensing the shift in her brother's mood, approached him. What is it, Gareth? She asked, her voice quiet. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers. It is from Lord Elmsworth, he said, referring to a neighboring lord, one with whom Northwick had a long-standing, though sometimes uneasy, alliance. He requests my presence at a feast, to celebrate the winter solstice. Alara frowned. Elmsworth is unpredictable, she said. His feasts are often more about politics than celebration. Gareth nodded, his jaw tight. I am aware of his reputation, he said. But I cannot refuse his invitation. It would be seen as an insult, a breach of courtesy. Isabel, who had been listening intently, felt a prickle of unease. She knew that the politics of the noble houses were complex and often treacherous, and she worried about Gareth walking into a potentially dangerous situation. Will you go? She asked, her voice hesitant. Gareth turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a question, perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement of her concern. I must, he said. It is my duty. But I will not go alone. I will take a company of my men for protection. He paused, then added, and I would like you to accompany me, my lady. Isabel was surprised by his request. Me? She asked. But why? You are a lady of the court, he said. You understand the nuances of noble etiquette, the subtleties of political maneuvering. Your presence would be valuable. There was more to it than that, Isabel sensed. He wanted her there, not just for her knowledge, but for her company, for the unspoken connection that had grown between them. I would be honored, she said, her heart quickening with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The preparations for the journey to Lord Elmsworth's castle began immediately. Gareth selected a company of 20 men, his most trusted and experienced warriors. Alara oversaw the packing of provisions and gifts, ensuring that they would be well prepared for the journey and the feast. Isabel, with Alara's help, chose a gown suitable for the occasion, a rich, deep blue velvet, trimmed with fur, that would both keep her warm and present a dignified appearance. She also packed a small, jeweled dagger, a gift from her late husband, which she always carried with her for protection. The journey to Elmsworth's castle took 3 days, through a landscape of snow-covered hills and frozen forests. The weather was cold but clear, and the company made good progress. Gareth rode at the head of the column, his presence a reassuring source of strength and confidence. Isabel rode beside him, often engaging in quiet conversation. She learned more about his life, his responsibilities, his hopes and fears. He, in turn, seemed to open up to her, revealing a side of himself that he rarely showed to others. As they approached Elmsworth's castle, Isabel felt a growing sense of unease. The castle was larger and more opulent than Northwick, but it lacked the sense of strength and solidity. It felt ostentatious, a display of wealth and power that seemed designed to intimidate. They were greeted at the gates by Lord Elmsworth himself, a portly man with a florid face and a booming laugh. He welcomed Gareth with effusive courtesy, his eyes lingering on Isabel with undisguised interest. "Sir Gareth," he exclaimed, "welcome to my humble abode. And who is this lovely creature? A rare flower indeed, to grace my winter feast." Gareth introduced Isabel, his voice formal and controlled. "Lady Isabel of Wessex," he said. "She is my guest at Northwick." Elmsworth's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he regained his composure. "A lady of Wessex?" he said. "Indeed. We are honored by your presence, my lady." He led them into the castle, through a series of lavishly decorated halls and chambers. The feast was already underway, the great hall filled with guests, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and perfume. Isabel felt a sense of overwhelm, surrounded by so many strangers, by the noise and the opulence. She stayed close to Gareth, drawing strength from his presence. As they were seated at the high table, Isabel noticed the subtle glances, the whispered conversations, the assessing looks directed at her and Gareth. She realized that they were the subject of much speculation, their relationship a source of curiosity and intrigue. A serving girl, no older than 15, placed a plate before Isabel and whispered, "Beware the wine, my lady." Isabel looked at Gareth. She pointed with her chin, barely moving, at the goblet before her. "It is a warning," she whispers to him. The feast was a lavish affair, with course after course of rich food and drink. But beneath the surface of celebration, Isabel sensed an undercurrent of tension, of political maneuvering, of hidden agendas. The whispers of the serving girl fresh in her mind. Elmsworth, though seemingly jovial, was a shrewd and calculating man, and she knew that he had his own reasons for inviting Gareth to this feast. There were secrets here, hidden beneath the smiles and the polite conversation, and Isabel felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something was about to go terribly wrong. Chapter 7. The Frozen Heart Thaws. The evening progressed, and with each passing course, Isabel's unease grew. The wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions. The conversations around the high table became more boisterous, the laughter more forced. Isabel noticed that Lord Elmsworth kept plying Gareth with drink, encouraging him to partake in the revelry, while subtly probing him with questions about Northwick, about his defenses, about his alliances. Gareth, however, remained remarkably composed. He drank sparingly, answering Elmsworth's questions with careful diplomacy, revealing nothing of substance. Isabel, following the serving girl's warning, barely touched her wine, observing the scene with growing apprehension. She noticed the way Elmsworth's eyes kept returning to her, lingering with a speculative gleam that made her skin crawl. At one point, Elmsworth leaned towards her, his voice slurred with wine. "You are a rare beauty, my lady," he said, his breath hot on her cheek. "A woman like you deserves attention. You are wasted on a cold, distant night like Gareth." Isabel recoiled, her hand instinctively moving to the small dagger concealed beneath her gown. "I am content with my situation, my lord," she said, her voice cold and firm. Elmsworth chuckled, a sound that lacked any genuine mirth. "Content?" he said. "Or merely resigned? You are a woman of spirit, my lady. You deserve more than a life of solitude and duty." He reached out and touched her hand, his fingers lingering on hers. Isabel pulled her hand away, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. Gareth, who had been observing the exchange with a growing sense of displeasure, intervened. "Lord Elmsworth," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I believe you have had enough wine. I suggest you retire to your chambers." Elmsworth glared at Gareth, his face flushed with anger. "Are you presuming to tell me what to do in my own castle, Northwick?" He sneered. "I am merely suggesting what is best for your health, and for the dignity of your guests," Gareth replied, his voice calm but firm. The tension between the two men was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenge. The other guests at the high table fell silent, watching the exchange with bated breath. Before Elmsworth could respond, a commotion erupted at the other end of the hall. A group of men, dressed in the livery of a rival lord, Lord Balder, stormed into the hall, their swords drawn. "Elmsworth," one of the men shouted, "we have come to claim what is rightfully ours." Chaos erupted. Guests screamed and scrambled for safety, tables were overturned, and the hall became a scene of confusion and violence. Gareth immediately drew his sword, his movements swift and decisive. "Isabel, stay close to me," he ordered, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He positioned himself between Isabel and the approaching men, his sword a gleaming arc of steel. His men, who had been seated at tables throughout the hall, quickly rallied to his side, forming a protective circle around him and Isabel. The fighting was fierce and brutal. Swords clashed, men shouted and groaned, and the air filled with the sounds of battle. Isabel, though terrified, remained close to Gareth, trusting in his protection. She saw the skill and ferocity with which he fought, his movements precise and deadly. He was a warrior, a protector, a man who would risk his life to defend those under his care. As the fighting raged, Isabel noticed that Elmsworth had disappeared. He had slipped away in the confusion, leaving his guests to fend for themselves. She realized that the attack by Lord Balder's men was no coincidence. It was a trap, orchestrated by Elmsworth, a plot to eliminate Gareth and seize control of Northwick. With Gareth's men, however, the tide of the battle turned. The invaders, though initially overwhelming, were gradually pushed back, their attack losing momentum. Gareth, with a combination of skill and courage, fought his way towards the leader of the attacking men, engaging him in a fierce duel. Isabel watched, her heart in her throat, as Gareth and the enemy lord clashed swords. The two men were evenly matched, their blades flashing in the firelight. Finally, with a swift, decisive move, Gareth disarmed his opponent, his sword pointing at the man's throat. "Yield," Gareth commanded, his voice ringing through the hall. The enemy lord, seeing that he was defeated, dropped his sword and surrendered. The remaining invaders, seeing their leader captured, followed suit, laying down their arms. The fighting ceased, the silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the combatants. Gareth, his chest heaving, his sword still dripping with blood, turned to Isabel. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Isabel nodded, her legs trembling. "Yes," she said. "Thanks to you." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, relief, gratitude, and something more, something that made her heart skip a beat. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers gentle. "You were brave," he said, his voice soft. It was a simple gesture, a brief touch, but it sent a wave of warmth through her, melting the frozen fear that had gripped her heart. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, she felt a connection to Gareth that went beyond gratitude, beyond admiration. It was a spark of something deeper, something that had been slowly building between them, now ignited by the shared danger and the realization of how much they meant to each other. It was that realization which was most frightening to her. Chapter 8. Oaths and Obligations. The aftermath of the attack was a scene of controlled chaos. Gareth, having secured the surrender of Lord Baldur's men, quickly took charge of the situation. He ordered his men to tend to the wounded, secure the castle, and find Lord Elmsworth, who was still missing. Isabel, though shaken by the violence, remained by Gareth's side, assisting where she could. She helped Alara, who had arrived with a small contingent of Northwick's healers, to bandage wounds and comfort the injured. She was impressed by Alara's calm efficiency and her unwavering composure in the face of adversity. It soon became clear that Elmsworth had indeed orchestrated the attack, hoping to eliminate Gareth and seize Northwick. He had fled the castle with a small group of loyal men, leaving a trail of betrayal and bloodshed in his wake. Gareth, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury, swore an oath to bring Elmsworth to justice. "He will pay for his treachery," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "He will not escape Northwick's wrath." Isabel understood his anger, his sense of betrayal. She had witnessed firsthand Elmsworth's duplicity, his willingness to sacrifice innocent lives for his own ambition. But she also worried about the consequences of Gareth's pursuit, the dangers he would face in seeking revenge. "Be careful, Gareth," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Elmsworth is a dangerous man. He will not hesitate to use any means to achieve his goals." Gareth met her gaze, his eyes softening slightly. "I will be careful," he said, "but I cannot let him go unpunished. I have a duty to my people, to my ancestors, to ensure that Northwick remains safe and secure." He paused, then added, "And I have a duty to you, my lady. I brought you here, into this danger. I will not let any harm come to you." His words touched her deeply, stirring a mix of emotions within her. She was grateful for his protection, for his unwavering commitment to her safety. But she also felt a growing sense of unease about the oaths he had sworn, the obligations that weighed heavily on him. The next few days were spent preparing for their departure from Elmsworth's castle. Gareth, having secured the castle and installed a temporary garrison to maintain order, decided to return to Northwick. He sent messengers to the other lords of the region, informing them of Elmsworth's treachery and seeking their support in bringing him to justice. The journey back to Northwick was somber and tense. Gareth was preoccupied with his plans for pursuing Elmsworth, his mind consumed by thoughts of revenge and justice. Isabel, though relieved to be returning to the safety of Northwick, felt a growing distance between them, a barrier created by his oaths and obligations. One evening, as they camped by a frozen river, Isabel approached Gareth, who was standing alone, gazing at the moonlit landscape. "Gareth," she said, her voice hesitant, "may I speak with you?" He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Of course, my lady," he said. "I am concerned about you," she said, "about the path you are choosing. Revenge is a dangerous pursuit. It can consume you, destroy you." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I know the risks," he said, "but I cannot stand idly by while Elmsworth threatens everything I hold dear." "But is it worth sacrificing your own peace, your own happiness?" she asked, her voice pleading. He sighed, a sound of weariness and resignation. "I have sworn oaths, my lady," he said. "Oaths that I cannot break. I am bound by duty, by honor." "And what about love?" Isabel asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Is there no room for love in your life?" He looked away, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon. "Love is a weakness," he said, his voice low. A distraction. A man in my position cannot afford such vulnerabilities. Isabel felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the connection they had shared, the spark that had ignited between them, might lead to something more. But his words, his unwavering commitment to his duty, seemed to extinguish that hope. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. "No, my lady," he said. "I do not believe you do. You have not lived a life bound by oaths, by obligations. You have not known the weight of responsibility that rests upon my shoulders." He paused, then added, "But I thank you for your concern. It is appreciated." He turned and walked away, leaving Isabel standing alone by the frozen river, her heart heavy with a sense of disappointment and a growing realization that the oaths and obligations that defined Gareth's life might forever stand between them, a barrier that even the strongest love might not be able to overcome. The frozen river seemed to mock her, reflecting the state of his heart. Chapter 9. The Serpent in the Garden. Back at Northwick, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The news of Elmsworth's treachery had spread quickly, and the other lords of the region, though wary of Northwick's growing power, had pledged their support in bringing him to justice. Gareth, however, remained restless, his mind still consumed by the pursuit of Elmsworth. He spent hours poring over maps, planning his strategy, and preparing his men for the inevitable confrontation. Isabel, meanwhile, found herself increasingly drawn into the daily life of Northwick. She assisted Alara with managing the household, helped to organize the winter stores, and even began to teach some of the younger children to read and write. She found a sense of purpose in these activities, a way to contribute to the community that had offered her refuge. But the shadow of Elmsworth's betrayal still hung over Northwick, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond its walls. And the growing distance between Isabel and Gareth, the barrier created by his oaths and obligations, continued to weigh heavily on her heart. One afternoon, while walking in the snow-covered gardens, Isabel encountered Alara, who was overseeing the pruning of some winter roses. "Alara," Isabel said, approaching her, "may I speak with you?" Alara looked up, a polite smile on her face. "Of course, my lady," she said. "It is about Gareth," Isabel said, her voice hesitant. I am worried about him. He seems consumed by this pursuit of Elmsworth." Alara sighed, a sound of weariness and concern. "I know," she said. "He has always been like this, ever since the death of our parents." Isabel's eyes widened. "Your parents?" she asked. "What happened to them?" Alara hesitated for a moment, then said, "They were murdered, my lady, by a rival lord, a man who coveted Northwick's lands and power. Gareth, who was only a boy at the time, witnessed their deaths. It changed him. He swore an oath to avenge them, to protect Northwick from all enemies." Isabel felt a pang of sympathy for Gareth, understanding now the source of his unwavering commitment to duty, the depth of his pain and his anger. "And did he avenge them?" she asked. Alara nodded. "He did," she said. "He tracked down the man responsible and killed him. But the victory was bittersweet. It did not bring back our parents, and it left Gareth with a burden of guilt and a sense of responsibility that he has carried ever since."
Isabel understood.
Gareth's oaths were not just about duty, they were about a deep-seated need for justice, for redemption, for protecting those he loved from the pain he had experienced. I care for him, Alara," Isabel confessed, her voice low. "But I fear that his oaths will always stand between us." Alara looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "Gareth is a good man, my lady," she said. "But he is also a man of his word. He will not break his oaths, not even for love." She paused, then added, "But perhaps love can be a source of strength, not weakness. Perhaps it can help him to heal, to find peace." Isabel looked at Alara, a flicker of hope rekindled in her heart. Perhaps Alara was right. Perhaps love, instead of being a distraction, could be a force for good, a way to help Gareth overcome his past and embrace a future that was not solely defined by duty and obligation. Later that evening, a messenger arrived, bearing a letter for Gareth. Isabel, who was in the great hall with Gareth and Alara, saw his expression change as he read the letter. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightened, and a look of cold fury crossed his face. "What is it, Gareth?" Alara asked, her voice filled with concern. Gareth looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "It is from one of my spies," he said. "Elmsworth has been sighted. He is hiding in the ruins of Castle Draken, an old, abandoned fortress in the mountains." Castle Draken. The name sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. It was a place of legend, a place said to be haunted by the ghosts of its past, a place of darkness and despair. "That is a dangerous place, Gareth," Alara said. "It is a trap." Gareth nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, "but I cannot let him escape. I must bring him to justice." He turned to Isabel, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a plea, perhaps, or a silent acknowledgement of the danger he was facing. But another figure entered the hall. A knight, dressed in Northwick colors, yet unfamiliar. "My lord," he bows to Gareth. "There is something you should know. A secret I was sworn to keep, but my Lady Isabel," he turns to her, "your husband's brother, Lord Alaric, paid Elmsworth. He wanted you removed, so he hired Elmsworth to kill you, and failing that, to capture you. The attack on the feast was not about Northwick. It was about you. And the price was the lands along your border." Isabel felt the color drain from her face. This man, the serpent, had been in Northwick this entire time. But why would he reveal this now? "And why should we believe you, traitor?" Gareth snarls, drawing his sword. "Because the knight says." "My loyalties shifted the moment Alaric agreed to work with Elmsworth. And because he looks directly at Isabel. He also sent assassins after your cousin, Alara of Lidford. She is dead, my lady. Everything is built upon lies and betrayal, it seems." Chapter 10. Trials of Trust. The revelation struck Isabel like a physical blow. The air was sucked from her lungs, leaving her gasping, her mind reeling in disbelief. Alaric, her own brother-in-law, the man who had sworn to protect her, had orchestrated her death and the murder of her beloved cousin. The world tilted on its axis, the foundations of her trust crumbling beneath her feet. Gareth, his sword still drawn, stood poised to strike the knight, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. But Isabel, despite her shock and grief, held up a hand, her voice trembling. "Wait, Gareth," she pleaded. Let him explain." The knight, his face pale but resolute, met Isabel's gaze. "My name is Sir Calin," he said. "I was once loyal to Alaric, but his alliance with Elmsworth, his willingness to sacrifice innocent lives, sickened me. I could no longer serve him." "And you expect us to believe you?" Gareth challenged, his voice still laced with suspicion. "You, who served a man who plotted against my guest, against Northwick?" "I understand your doubt, my lord," Calin said. "But I swear on my honor, on the memory of my own family, that I speak the truth. Alaric's ambition knows no bounds. He desires your lands, my lady." He turned to Isabel, "and he saw you as an obstacle. Elmsworth was merely a tool, a pawn in his game." He paused, then added, "I know this because I was the one who carried Alaric's messages to Elmsworth. I was the one who delivered the gold, the promises of land. I was complicit in his treachery." Isabel felt a wave of nausea, the weight of Caelin's words crushing her. She had suspected Alaric's ambition, his resentment of her, but she had never imagined he would go to such lengths. And Alara, her dear cousin, dead because of Alaric's greed. "Alara," she whispered, her voice choked with grief. "He killed her?" Calin nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. "He sent assassins disguised as bandits," he said. "They ambushed her on the road to Lidford. She never reached her destination." Tears streamed down Isabel's face, her body shaking with sobs. Alara, her childhood companion, her confidant, her friend gone. The pain was unbearable, a gaping wound in her heart. Gareth, seeing her distress, lowered his sword slightly, his expression softening with concern. He sheathed his blade and stepped towards her, his hand reaching out to comfort her. "Isabel," he said, his voice gentle, "I am so sorry." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with grief and betrayal. He was my family," she said, her voice trembling. "I trusted him." Gareth's hand tightened on her shoulder, his touch a source of strength and reassurance. "I know," he said, "but you're safe now. You are under my protection. I will not let Alaric harm you." He turned back to Kaelin, his eyes hardening with resolve. "If what you say is true," he said, "then Alaric has committed treason, not only against Lady Isabel, but against the entire realm. He will be brought to justice." "I will help you, my lord," Kaelin said. "I know Alaric's weaknesses, his allies, his plans. I can lead you to him." Gareth studied Kaelin for a long moment, his gaze piercing, assessing the man's sincerity. He sensed that Kaelin was telling the truth, that his remorse was genuine. But trust, once broken, was not easily restored. "You will be watched closely, Sir Kaelin," Gareth said. "Your every move will be scrutinized. If you betray us, if you attempt to deceive us, you will face Northwick's justice." "I understand, my lord," Kaelin said, bowing his head. "I am at your service." The revelation of Alaric's treachery and Alara's death cast a pall over Northwick. The grief and anger were palpable, fueling a desire for justice, for retribution. Gareth, driven by his own sense of betrayal and his growing protectiveness towards Isabel, began to plan his next move. Isabel, consumed by grief, withdrew into herself. She spent hours in the chapel, praying for Alara's soul, seeking solace in her faith. She avoided Gareth, unable to face him, unable to reconcile the man she had grown to care for with the world of violence and betrayal that he inhabited. One evening, as she sat alone in the chapel, Gareth entered, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. He stood behind her, his presence a comforting weight in the dimly lit space. "Isabel," he said, his voice soft, "I know you are grieving, but you cannot shut yourself away. You cannot let Alaric's treachery destroy you." She turned, her eyes filled with tears. He killed her, Gareth," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He killed my cousin, my friend, and he tried to kill me." Gareth knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to take hers. "I know," he said, "and I will make him pay. I swear to you, Isabel, Alaric will face justice." She looked at him, her gaze searching his. "And what about you, Gareth?" she asked. "Will you ever find peace? Will you ever be free from this cycle of violence and revenge?" He looked away, his expression troubled. "I do not know," he said. "I am bound by my oaths, by my duty. I must protect Northwick. I must protect you. But at what cost?" she asked, her voice pleading. "At what cost to your own soul?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "The cost is high, my lady," he said, "but it is a price I am willing to pay." His words, though resolute, filled her with a sense of despair. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of his responsibilities, the unwavering commitment to his duty. And she realized that even her love, her growing desire for him, might not be enough to break the chains that bound him to his past, to his oaths, to his obligations. The trials of trust were far from over. Chapter 11. The Huntress and the Hawk. The decision was made. Gareth, with Isabel and a select company of his men, including the newly aligned Sir Kaelin, would journey to Castle Draken to confront Elmsworth. It was a risky undertaking, venturing into a treacherous and unknown territory, but Gareth was determined to bring Elmsworth to justice, not only for his crimes against Northwick, but for his role in Alaric's plot against Isabel and the murder of her cousin. Isabel, despite her grief and her apprehension, insisted on accompanying Gareth. She could not remain at Northwick, haunted by the ghosts of her past, while Gareth faced danger on her behalf. She needed to be there, to witness the reckoning, to find some measure of closure. "I will not be a burden, Gareth," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting his. "I can ride, I can fight, and I can offer counsel. I will not cower in fear while you risk your life for me." Gareth studied her for a long moment, his gaze assessing her determination, her strength. He saw the fire in her eyes, the resolve that had replaced her earlier despair. He realized that she was not just a noble lady seeking refuge, she was a warrior in her own right, a woman who would not be deterred by danger. "Very well, my lady," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You shall accompany me, but you will obey my orders, and you will stay close to me at all times." "I understand," she said, nodding. The journey to Castle Draken was arduous and perilous. They traveled through rugged mountain terrain, the snow-covered peaks looming above them, the wind howling through the narrow passes. The air was thin and cold, and the nights were spent huddled around meager fires, seeking warmth and respite from the elements. Isabel, despite her noble upbringing, proved to be a resilient and capable traveler. She endured the hardships without complaint, her spirit undaunted by the challenges. She rode alongside Gareth, her presence a source of strength and encouragement to him. During the long hours on horseback, they spoke of many things of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Isabel learned more about Gareth's childhood, about the loss of his parents, about the burden of responsibility he had carried since a young age. Gareth, in turn, learned more about Isabel's life at court, about her marriage to Edmund, about the suffocating web of intrigue that had driven her to seek refuge at Northwick. The shared experiences, the dangers they faced together, forged a deeper bond between them. The distance that had grown between them after Elmsworth's betrayal began to diminish, replaced by a renewed sense of trust and understanding. One evening, as they camped near the base of a towering mountain, Gareth and Isabel found themselves alone, gazing up at the star-studded sky. "It is beautiful," Isabel said, her voice soft, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "It is," Gareth agreed, "but it can also be deceiving. The stars seem so close, so serene, but they are vast and distant, beyond our reach." Isabel looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Are you speaking of the stars, Gareth, or of something else?" she asked. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Perhaps both," he said. "There are things in this world that seem attainable, but are forever beyond our grasp." "And what things are those, Gareth?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his gaze shifting to the distant peaks. "Peace," he said. "Happiness. A life free from duty, from obligation." Isabel felt a pang of sadness, understanding the longing in his voice, the yearning for a life that seemed forever out of reach. "And love?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He turned back to her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze of vulnerability, a hint of the emotions he kept carefully guarded. "Love is a risk, my lady," he said, his voice low. "A gamble. It can be a source of strength, but it can also be a weakness, a vulnerability that can be exploited." "But is it not worth the risk?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Is it not better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all?" He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers gentle, tracing the curve of her jaw. "Perhaps," he said. "But for a man like me, a man bound by oaths, by duty, love is a luxury I cannot afford to indulge." His words, though seemingly final, did not extinguish the hope that flickered within her. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the battle between his duty and his desires, the longing for a connection that he feared to embrace. She leaned closer, her breath mingling with his. "Gareth," she whispered, "do not be afraid to feel. Do not be afraid to love." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, with the tension of their desires, with the weight of their shared burdens. The huntress was closing in on her prey. He was the hawk, trained to obey, and yet there was still that pull of the wild within him. Chapter 12. Scars of the Soul. Their arrival at Castle Draken was met with an eerie silence. The ancient fortress, perched precariously on a rocky crag, loomed above them, a skeletal silhouette against the darkening sky. Its crumbling walls and broken towers spoke of a violent past, of battles fought and lives lost. The wind whistled through the ruins, carrying with it the whispers of forgotten ghosts. Gareth, his senses on high alert, led his company cautiously through the overgrown courtyard, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the shadows. Isabel, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger, stayed close beside him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Kaelin, who had proven to be a valuable guide and advisor during their journey, pointed towards a partially collapsed tower. "Elmsworth is likely hiding there," he said. "It offers the best vantage point and the easiest escape route." Gareth nodded, his expression grim. "We will approach with caution," he said. "He will be expecting us, and he will not hesitate to fight." They advanced slowly, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of snow and debris. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional caw of a raven and the creaking of the ancient stones. As they neared the tower, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Elmsworth, his face haggard, his clothes torn, his eyes filled with a desperate, cornered animal look. He held a crossbow in his hands, aimed directly at Gareth. "Welcome, Northwick," Elmsworth sneered. "I have been expecting you." Gareth stopped, his sword held steady. "Elmsworth," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Your treachery ends here. Surrender, and you will be spared a swift death." Elmsworth laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Surrender?" he said. "Never. I will fight to the death, and I will take you with me." He fired the crossbow, the bolt whistling through the air, narrowly missing Gareth's head. Gareth reacted instantly, deflecting the bolt with his sword and charging towards Elmsworth. The fight was brief but brutal. Gareth, fueled by his anger and his desire for justice, quickly overwhelmed Elmsworth, his superior swordsmanship proving too much for the older, weaker man. Elmsworth, desperate and outmatched, fought with a ferocity born of desperation, but it was not enough. Gareth disarmed him, his sword pointing at Elmsworth's throat. "Yield," Gareth commanded, his voice ringing through the ruins. Elmsworth, his chest heaving, his face covered in sweat and blood, glared at Gareth with hatred. "I will never yield to you, Northwick," he spat. "You may kill me, but you will never break me." Gareth's hand tightened on his sword, his knuckles white. He could end it here, with a single stroke, and avenge the lives Elmsworth had taken, the betrayal he had committed. But something held him back. He looked at Isabel, her face pale but resolute, her eyes fixed on him. He saw the plea in her gaze, the silent appeal for mercy, for an end to the cycle of violence. He lowered his sword slightly. "I will not kill you, Elmsworth," he said, his voice hoarse. "You will be taken back to Northwick, where you will face justice for your crimes." Elmsworth stared at him in disbelief, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and contempt. You are a fool, Northwick," he said. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Gareth ignored him, turning to his men. "Bind him," he ordered, "and see that he does not escape." As Elmsworth was being secured, Isabel approached Gareth, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Gareth," she said, her voice soft, "for showing mercy." He looked at her, his expression troubled. "It was not mercy, my lady," he said. "It was justice. He will be judged by the law, not by my sword." But Isabel knew that it was more than that. It was a sign of his changing heart, of the influence she had on him, of the possibility that he could break free from the chains of his past, from the cycle of violence and revenge. Later that evening, as they camped within the ruins of Castle Draken, preparing for their return journey to Northwick, Isabel found Gareth standing alone, gazing up at the moonlit sky. She approached him, her footsteps silent on the snow-covered ground. "Gareth," she said, her voice hesitant, "may I speak with you?" He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Of course, my lady," he said. "You spared Elmsworth's life," she said. "Why?" He looked away, his gaze shifting to the distant peaks. "I do not know," he said. "Perhaps I am tired of killing. Perhaps I am beginning to see that there is more to life than duty, than revenge." He paused, then added, Perhaps you have shown me a different path." Isabel felt a surge of hope, a warmth spreading through her chest. There is always a different path, Gareth, she said. You do not have to be bound by your past. You can choose to forgive, to heal, to love. He turned back to her, his eyes searching hers. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a longing for something more than the life he had always known. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his scars, the marks of his past battles, both physical and emotional. These scars, she said, her voice soft, they are a part of you, Gareth. But they do not define you. You are more than your past, more than your duty. You are a man of strength, of compassion, of honor. And you are capable of great love. He closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. He leaned into her touch, his body trembling slightly. The scars of his soul, the wounds that had festered for so long, began to ache, not with pain, but with a longing for healing, for release. The huntress had cornered the hawk, and he had no desire to flee. Chapter 13. A Dance of Deception. The return to Northwick was marked by a subdued atmosphere. Elmsworth, securely bound and under constant guard, was imprisoned in the deepest dungeon. Gareth, though victorious in his pursuit, seemed more withdrawn than ever, the weight of his actions, the choices he had made, pressing heavily upon him. Isabel, while relieved that Elmsworth was no longer a threat, found herself increasingly concerned about Gareth. She saw the turmoil in his eyes, the struggle between his duty and his growing feelings for her. She knew that he was at a crossroads, that he had to choose between the life he had always known and the possibility of a different future, a future that included her. Upon their return, a raven arrived from King Edric. Gareth was summoned to the capital. Gareth knew that King Edric's summons would be for Lord Alaric's trial. Isabel and Gareth, with Kaelin and a small escort, traveled to King Edric's court. The king's court was a stark contrast to the stark simplicity of Northwick. It was a place of opulence and grandeur, of elaborate rituals and intricate social hierarchies. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and incense, the sounds of music and laughter, the whispers of intrigue and gossip. Isabel, having spent much of her life at court, felt a familiar sense of unease, of being surrounded by hidden agendas and treacherous alliances. She knew that she had to be careful, that every word, every gesture would be scrutinized, interpreted, and potentially used against her. Gareth, though accustomed to the rough and tumble world of battle, seemed out of place in this environment of courtly manners and subtle deceits. He was a man of action, not words, and he found the constant posturing and pretense to be both tiresome and irritating. They were greeted by King Edric, a man of middle age, with a shrewd gaze and a commanding presence. He welcomed Gareth with formal courtesy, acknowledging his service in capturing Elmsworth, but his eyes lingered on Isabel with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Sir Gareth," the king said, "you have done the realm a great service. Elmsworth's treachery will be punished. But I understand that there is more to this story, that Lord Alaric, Lady Isabel's own brother-in-law, was involved in this plot." "That is correct, Your Majesty," Gareth said, his voice firm. "Alaric conspired with Elmsworth to kill Lady Isabel and seize her lands. He also arranged the murder of her cousin, Lady Alara of Lidford." The king's eyebrows rose. "These are grave accusations, Sir Gareth," he said. "Do you have proof?" "We do, Your Majesty," Isabel said, stepping forward. "Sir Kaelin, a former knight in Alaric's service, has confessed to his involvement and has provided evidence of Alaric's treachery." Kaelin stepped forward, bowing to the king. "Your Majesty," he said, "I swear on my honor that what Lady Isabel says is true. I was a witness to Alaric's plotting, and I can provide you with the names of his co-conspirators." The king listened intently, his gaze shifting between Gareth, Isabel, and Kaelin. He was a shrewd judge of character, and he sensed that they were telling the truth. But he also knew that Alaric was a powerful and influential lord, with many allies at court. "Lord Alaric will be summoned to answer these charges," the king said. "He will be given a fair trial, and if he is found guilty, he will face the full consequences of his actions." The trial was set for the following day. Isabel and Gareth spent the evening preparing their testimony, gathering evidence, and strategizing with Kaelin. They knew that Alaric would not go down without a fight, that he would use every trick, every lie, every connection he had to try to save himself. As they sat together in their chambers, reviewing the details of the case, Isabel felt a growing sense of dread. She knew that this trial would be a test, not only of Alaric's guilt, but of her own strength, her own ability to confront the man who had betrayed her, the man who had murdered her cousin. Gareth, sensing her unease, reached out and took her hand. "Isabel," he said, his voice gentle, "you are not alone in this. I will stand by you. I will protect you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and a growing sense of hope. "Thank you, Gareth," she said. I do not know what I would do without you." He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her. "You are strong, Isabel," he said. "Stronger than you know. You will face this, and you will prevail." His words, his presence, gave her the courage she needed. She knew that the trial would be a difficult and painful ordeal, but she was ready to face it, to fight for justice, for Alara, for herself. The dance of deception was about to begin, and Isabel, with Gareth by her side, was prepared to play her part, to expose the truth and bring Alaric to his reckoning. Chapter 14. The Lioness Uncaged. The day of the trial dawned cold and gray, the sky mirroring the somber mood that gripped the court. The great hall was packed with nobles, courtiers, and onlookers, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. The air was thick with anticipation, with the whispers of speculation and the weight of unspoken judgments. Isabel, dressed in a simple but elegant gown of dark blue, stood beside Gareth, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had spent the night preparing, steeling herself for the confrontation with Alaric, for the painful task of recounting his treachery and the loss of her cousin. Gareth, clad in his Northwick armor, stood tall and resolute beside her, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. He had insisted on wearing his armor, a symbol of his defiance, a warning to Alaric and his allies that he would not be intimidated. King Edric entered the hall, his face stern, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. He took his seat on the throne, and the trial began. Alaric was brought before the king, his hands bound, his face pale but defiant. He was a man of striking appearance, with sharp features and a commanding presence, but his eyes held a flicker of fear, a hint of the desperation that lurked beneath his facade of arrogance. The charges were read, outlining Alaric's conspiracy with Elmsworth, his attempted murder of Isabel, and his role in the death of Alara. Alaric listened impassively, his expression unchanging, his gaze fixed on the king. When asked to plead, Alaric responded with a sneer. "I deny all charges," he said, his voice ringing through the hall. "These accusations are baseless, fabricated by my enemies to discredit me and seize my lands." Gareth stepped forward, his voice firm and unwavering. "We have evidence, Your Majesty," he said. "Sir Kaelin, a former knight in Alaric's service, has confessed to his involvement and is prepared to testify." Kaelin was called to the stand, and he recounted his story, detailing Alaric's plot, his messages to Elmsworth, the gold and promises of land that had been exchanged. He spoke clearly and convincingly, his remorse evident, his testimony damning. Alaric, however, remained defiant. He cross-examined Kaelin, attempting to discredit him, to portray him as a disgruntled servant seeking revenge. But Kaelin held his ground, his answers consistent, his testimony unshaken. Then, it was Isabel's turn to testify. She stepped forward, her gaze meeting Alaric's. She saw the hatred in his eyes, the resentment that had festered for so long. But she did not flinch. She would not be intimidated. She recounted her story, her escape from her own castle, her refuge at Northwick, the attack at Elmsworth's feast, the revelation of Alaric's treachery. She spoke with passion and conviction, her voice trembling with emotion, but her words clear and unwavering. She told of Alara, of their childhood friendship, of their shared dreams, of the pain of her loss. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, but she did not falter. She would not let Alaric see her weakness. "He murdered my cousin," she said, her voice choked with grief. He tried to murder me. He is a traitor, a liar, and a murderer. He deserves to face the full consequences of his actions. Alaric, seeing the impact of her testimony, attempted to interrupt, to shout her down. But King Edric silenced him with a raised hand. "You'll have your turn, Lord Alaric," the king said. "But for now you will listen." Isabel continued her testimony, detailing Alaric's attempts to control her, to manipulate her, to seize her lands. She spoke of his ambition, his greed, his utter disregard for the lives of others. When she finished, the hall was silent. The weight of her words, the truth of her accusations, hung heavy in the air. Alaric, sensing that the tide had turned against him, changed his tactics. He attempted to portray himself as the victim, as a man betrayed by his own family, by his own servants. He claimed that Isabel was unstable, that she had been manipulated by Gareth, that she was seeking to usurp his rightful inheritance. But his lies were hollow, his arguments unconvincing. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the testimony of Caelan and Isabel too compelling to ignore. Finally, King Edric delivered his verdict. "Lord Alaric," he said, his voice ringing through the hall, "you are found guilty of treason, of attempted murder, and of the murder of Lady Alara of Lidford. You are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your possessions. You are sentenced to death." A gasp went through the hall, followed by a murmur of approval. Justice had been served. Alaric, his face contorted with rage and despair, lunged towards Isabel, his hands outstretched, his eyes filled with hatred. "You will pay for this, witch," he screamed. "You will all pay." Gareth reacted instantly, stepping between Alaric and Isabel, his sword drawn. He deflected Alaric's attack, disarming him with a swift, decisive move. "Enough," Gareth said, his voice cold and dangerous. "Your reign of terror is over." The guards seized Alaric, dragging him away, his screams and curses echoing through the hall. Isabel, her body trembling, her heart pounding, looked at Gareth, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you, Gareth," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"You saved me."
He sheathed his sword, his expression softening. "You saved yourself, Isabel," he said. "Your courage, your strength, your testimony, you brought him to justice." The lioness had been uncaged, her roar echoing through the court, her claws bared, her vengeance complete. But the victory was bittersweet, the pain of her loss still raw, the scars of betrayal still fresh. Chapter 15. Echoes of War. With Alaric's trial concluded and his sentence carried out swiftly, a sense of closure, albeit a somber one, settled over Isabel. The immediate threat was gone, but the echoes of betrayal and the pain of Alara's loss lingered. The king, recognizing Gareth's service and acknowledging the injustice Isabel had suffered, offered them both respite at the royal court. However, Gareth, uncomfortable in the gilded cage of courtly life, expressed his desire to return to Northwick. Isabel, though grateful for the king's offer, found herself yearning for the familiar solace of the northern stronghold, for the quiet strength it represented, and for the man who had become its embodiment. Before their departure, King Edric, in a private audience with Gareth and Isabel, made a pronouncement that would alter the course of their lives. "Sir Gareth," the king said, his voice grave, "your loyalty and service to the realm have been exemplary. You have rooted out treachery and upheld justice. In recognition of your deeds, and in light of the vacancy created by Alaric's demise, I hereby bestow upon you the title of Lord Warden of the Northern Marches. You will be responsible for the defense of the entire northern border, from the mountains to the sea." Gareth was stunned. This was a significant elevation, a position of immense power and responsibility. It was an honor, but also a burden, a commitment that would bind him even more tightly to his duty. "Your Majesty," Gareth said, bowing his head, "I am humbled by your trust. I accept this responsibility, and I swear to serve the realm with all my strength and loyalty." The king nodded, then turned to Isabel. "Lady Isabel," he said, "your courage and resilience in the face of adversity have been remarkable. You have endured betrayal and loss, yet you have emerged stronger, your spirit unbroken. In recognition of your strength, and in consideration of your lineage, I hereby restore to you your ancestral lands and titles. You will be Countess of Wessex in your own right, and you will hold a seat on the royal council. Isabel was equally surprised. This was a restoration of her birthright, a recognition of her own power and influence. It was an opportunity to rebuild her life, to shape her own destiny, to be more than just a pawn in the games of others. Your Majesty, Isabel said, curtsying deeply, I am grateful for your generosity and your faith in me. I accept this honor, and I swear to serve the realm with wisdom and justice. The king smiled, a rare and genuine expression of approval. I believe you will both serve the realm well, he said, and I trust that you will work together for the good of all. The journey back to Northwick was filled with a mixture of emotions. Gareth, though outwardly stoic, was clearly grappling with the weight of his new responsibilities. He was no longer just the Lord of Northwick, he was the guardian of the entire North, a key figure in the defense of the realm. Isabel, too, was contemplating the changes in her life. She was no longer a refugee, a woman seeking shelter. She was a countess, a powerful noble in her own right, with a voice in the affairs of the kingdom. As they rode together, Isabel sensed the growing distance between them, the barrier of duty and responsibility that threatened to separate them once more. Gareth, she said, her voice hesitant, this new title, this responsibility, will it change everything? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. It will change many things, my lady, he said. But it will not change my commitment to you, to your safety, to your well-being. But will it change us? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, his gaze searching hers.
I do not know, he said.
I am bound by oaths, by duty. I must serve the realm. I must protect the North. But he hesitated, then added, but I also care for you, Isabel. Deeply. And I do not want to lose you. His words, though guarded, offered a glimmer of hope. He had acknowledged his feelings for her, admitted that he did not want to lose her. It was a small step, but a significant one. And I care for you, Gareth, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I do not want to lose you either. They reached out to each other, their hands meeting, their fingers interlacing. It was a simple gesture, a brief touch, but it spoke volumes. It was a connection, a reaffirmation of their bond, a promise that they would face the future together, whatever it might hold. Back at Northwick, the news of Gareth's elevation and Isabel's restoration was met with a mixture of celebration and apprehension. The people of Northwick were proud of their lord, but they also understood the increased burdens he would now bear. The echoes of war were beginning to fade, replaced by the challenges of peace, of governance, of rebuilding. But the bond between Gareth and Isabel, forged in the crucible of adversity, remained strong, a beacon of hope in a world of uncertainty. The scars of the past were still there, but they were beginning to heal, replaced by the promise of a future they would face together, as Lord Warden and Countess, as man and woman, as two souls bound by duty, by honor, and by a love that was slowly, tentatively, beginning to blossom. Chapter 16. The Raven's Warning. The first few months of Gareth's tenure as Lord Warden were a whirlwind of activity. He traveled extensively throughout the Northern Territories, inspecting fortifications, meeting with local lords, and assessing the state of the defenses. The threat from beyond the border, though always present, had become more acute in recent years, with increasing raids by wild tribes and rumors of a growing unrest among the northern clans. Isabel, meanwhile, took on the responsibilities of governing her own lands, restoring order to Wessex after the chaos of Alaric's rule. She proved to be a wise and just ruler, earning the respect and loyalty of her people. She also worked closely with Gareth, advising him on matters of policy and diplomacy, using her knowledge of the court and her understanding of the noble houses to help him navigate the complex political landscape. Despite their demanding schedules, they made time for each other, finding moments of solace and connection amidst the pressures of their duties. They would ride together through the snow-covered hills, share quiet evenings by the fire, and exchange whispered words in the dimly lit corridors of Northwick. Their love, though still unspoken in its fullness, deepened with each passing day, a bond forged not just by passion, but by shared purpose, by mutual respect, and by a deep understanding of each other's burdens. One evening, as they sat together in the library, a raven arrived, bearing a message for Gareth. It was from one of his scouts, stationed on the far northern border. Gareth read the message, his expression growing grim. "What is it, Gareth?" Isabel asked, her voice filled with concern. He looked up, his eyes troubled. "The scout reports increased activity among the northern tribes," he said. "They are gathering in large numbers, preparing for something. It could be a raid, or it could be something more organized." Isabel felt a prickle of unease. The northern tribes were a constant threat, but they were usually fragmented, their raids sporadic and uncoordinated. A large-scale, organized attack would be a far more serious matter. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Gareth sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"I do not know," he said.
"But I cannot ignore it. I must investigate. I must be prepared for any eventuality." He decided to ride north himself, to assess the situation firsthand and to gather more intelligence. He would take a small company of his most trusted men, including Kaelin, who had proven to be a valuable ally and a skilled warrior. Isabel, though worried about his safety, understood the necessity of his journey. She knew that he could not delegate this responsibility, that he had to see for himself, to make his own judgment. "Be careful, Gareth," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Promise me you will return safely." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her. "I promise," he said. "I will not take unnecessary risks. I have too much to live for now." His words, his gaze, conveyed the depth of his feelings for her, the unspoken commitment that bound them together. The next morning, Gareth departed Northwick, riding north with his company, disappearing into the vast, snow-covered landscape. Isabel watched them go, her heart heavy with apprehension, her mind filled with prayers for his safe return. She spent the following days anxiously awaiting news, her thoughts constantly with Gareth, her fears growing with each passing hour. She busied herself with her duties, managing her lands, overseeing the preparations for the coming winter, but her mind was elsewhere, in the wild, unforgiving north, where Gareth faced unknown dangers. One evening, as she sat alone in her chamber, a raven arrived, bearing a message. It was not from Gareth, but from one of his lieutenants. Isabel's heart sank as she read the words. The message was brief and ominous. Gareth and his company had been ambushed by a large force of northern tribesmen. The fighting had been fierce, and the outcome was uncertain. The lieutenant had managed to escape and send the message, but he did not know Gareth's fate. Isabel felt a wave of despair, a cold fear gripping her heart. Gareth, her Gareth, might be dead, lost in the frozen wastes of the north. The thought was unbearable, a pain that cut deeper than any wound. She crumpled the message in her hand, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She could not accept it. She would not accept it. Gareth could not be dead. He was too strong, too skilled, too determined to survive. She rose from her chair, her resolve hardening. She would not sit idly by, waiting for news that might never come. She would go north herself. She would find Gareth. She would bring him home. The raven's warning had been heeded, but it would not be the final word. She was the Countess of Wessex, and she would not be defeated. She was Isabel, and she was coming for the man she loved. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. Isabel wasted no time. Gathering a small but loyal force of her own retainers, seasoned warriors who had served her family for years, she prepared for a perilous journey north. She donned her own armor, a lighter but still protective suit, and strapped her late husband's sword to her side. It was a symbol of her resolve, a reminder of the strength she carried within. Alara, having been informed of the situation, insisted on accompanying Isabel. Despite her grief over Gareth's potential fate and the lingering sorrow for their parents, Alara was a woman of Northwick, strong and resilient. She would not stand idly by while her brother was in danger. "I will ride with you, my lady," Alara said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with determination. "Gareth is my brother, and I will not abandon him." Isabel embraced Alara, grateful for her support, for her unwavering loyalty. Together, they would face the dangers of the North, united by their love for Gareth and their determination to bring him home. The journey north was even more arduous than Isabel remembered. The winter had deepened, the snow was thicker, the winds more fierce. The landscape was a vast, unforgiving expanse of white, the mountains looming above them like silent, watchful giants. They followed the trail left by Gareth's company, their hearts sinking as they discovered signs of the ambush. The snow was stained with blood, scattered weapons and armor lay abandoned, the silence broken only by the mournful cries of ravens. Isabel pressed on, her fear growing with each passing mile, but her resolve unshaken. She would not give up hope. She would find Gareth, dead or alive. After several days of relentless travel, they encountered a small band of Gareth's men, survivors of the ambush. They were wounded, exhausted, and demoralized, but they were alive. The lieutenant who had sent the message stepped forward, his face grim, his eyes filled with despair. "My lady," he said, bowing his head, "we were overwhelmed. The tribesmen were too many. We fought bravely," but he hesitated, then added, "Lord Gareth, he was last seen fighting near the river.
He may be dead."
Isabel felt a cold hand grip her heart, but she refused to yield to despair. "Show me," she said, her voice firm. "Take me to the place where you last saw him." The lieutenant led them to a frozen river, the banks scarred by the battle. The snow was trampled and bloodstained, the ice cracked and broken. There was no sign of Gareth, no trace of his body. Isabel dismounted, her legs trembling, her heart pounding. She walked along the riverbank, searching, scanning the snow, the ice, the surrounding trees. She called out Gareth's name, her voice echoing through the desolate landscape, but there was no answer. Alara, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears, joined Isabel in the search. They searched for hours, their hope dwindling with each passing moment, but they refused to give up. As the light began to fade, Isabel spotted something in the snow, a glint of metal. She rushed towards it, her heart leaping with a mixture of hope and dread. It was a sword, Gareth's sword, its hilt buried in the snow, its blade stained with blood. Isabel knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. It was real, tangible proof that Gareth had been here, that he had fought, that he might still be alive. But there was something else, something that made her heart skip a beat. Tied to the hilt of the sword was a small piece of cloth, a scrap of blue velvet, torn from her own gown, the gown she had worn at Elmsworth's feast. It was a signal, a message, a sign that Gareth was alive, that he had left this for her to find. Isabel clutched the piece of cloth to her chest, tears streaming down her face. He was alive. He had survived the ambush, and he was waiting for her. She looked up, her gaze sweeping over the surrounding landscape. There were tracks in the snow, leading away from the river, towards a dense forest. Gareth had gone that way, seeking shelter, seeking safety. "He is alive," she said, her voice filled with renewed hope. "He left this for me. He is waiting for me." Alara, her face lighting up with relief, embraced Isabel.
"We will find him," she said.
"We will bring him home." With renewed determination, Isabel and Alara, along with their combined forces, followed the tracks into the forest, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The flames of rebellion had been ignited, not just among the northern tribes, but within Isabel herself. She was no longer just a countess, a noble lady. She was a warrior, a huntress, a woman on a mission to rescue the man she loved. Chapter 18. The Broken Vow. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and snow, the trees thick and imposing, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. Isabel, her senses heightened, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation, followed the tracks, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. They moved cautiously, aware that they could be walking into another ambush, that the northern tribesmen could be lurking anywhere. But Isabel pressed on, driven by her love for Gareth and her unwavering determination to find him. After several hours of tracking, they came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, huddled near a meager fire, was a figure wrapped in furs. Isabel's heart leaped. It was Gareth. She rushed towards him, calling out his name, her voice filled with relief and joy. Gareth! Gareth! He looked up, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and recognition. He was wounded, his left arm bandaged and in a sling, his clothes torn and blood-stained. But he was alive. Isabel? He said, his voice weak, his gaze searching hers. Is it really you? She knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Gareth, it is me. I came for you. I would never abandon you. She embraced him, holding him close, her body trembling with relief. He clung to her, his grip weak but desperate, his head resting on her shoulder. I thought I would never see you again, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I promised I would return, she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. And I always keep my promises. Alara and the others gathered around, their faces filled with relief and joy. They tended to Gareth's wounds, providing him with food and water, wrapping him in warm furs. Gareth, his strength slowly returning, recounted the events of the ambush. He had been caught off guard, outnumbered and overwhelmed. He had fought bravely, but he had been wounded and separated from his men. He had managed to escape, seeking shelter in the forest, leaving the signal for Isabel to find. I knew you would come, he said, his gaze meeting Isabel's. I knew you would not give up on me. Never, she said, her voice firm. I will never give up on you. As Gareth recovered, they discussed their next move. They could not return to Northwick immediately. Gareth was too weak to travel, and the forest was still crawling with hostile tribesmen. They needed to find a safe place to regroup, to plan their next move. Kaelin, who had proven to be a resourceful and knowledgeable guide, suggested a hidden cave, a place known only to a few, where they could find shelter and safety. They made their way to the cave, a narrow opening concealed behind a frozen waterfall. The cave was surprisingly spacious and dry, providing a welcome respite from the harsh elements. As they settled in, Isabel tended to Gareth's wounds, changing his bandages, applying healing herbs. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her presence a source of comfort and strength. Gareth, she said, her voice soft, there is something I must tell you. Something I have kept hidden, even from myself. He looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. What is it, Isabel? He asked. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. I love you, Gareth, she said, her voice trembling. I have loved you for a long time, ever since you welcomed me into Northwick, ever since you showed me kindness and compassion, ever since you protected me from harm. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Isabel, he whispered. I know you are bound by oaths, by duty, she continued, and you have told me there is no room for such things. But I had to tell you. I could not keep it hidden any longer. He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. Isabel, he said, his voice hoarse, I have been a fool. A blind, stubborn fool. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in pain. I have denied my feelings for you. I have pushed you away. I have told myself that I could not love you, that I did not deserve you. But I was wrong. So very wrong. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers, filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. I love you, Isabel, he said, his voice firm, his words ringing with truth. I have loved you for a long time. Ever since I saw you standing in the snow, a vision of strength and beauty, a woman who had faced adversity and emerged unbroken. He paused, then added, my oaths, my duty, they are important, but they are not everything. I have been so focused on protecting others, on fulfilling my responsibilities, that I have forgotten to live, to love, to be happy. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. I was wrong to push you away. I was wrong to think that love was a weakness. It is a strength, Isabel, the greatest strength of all. And I will not deny it any longer. He draws her in and kisses her. A kiss that spoke of longing, need, regret, and a desperate desire to make up for lost time. A broken vow, but a heart finally whole. The hawk had escaped his cage, and now soared with the huntress. Chapter 19. Shadows of Allegiance. The days that followed in the hidden cave were a time of healing, both physical and emotional. Gareth's wounds, though serious, began to mend under Isabel's attentive care. More importantly, the walls he had built around his heart, the barriers of duty and obligation, crumbled under the weight of their shared love. They spoke for hours, sharing their pasts, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. They discovered a depth of connection that went beyond mere attraction, a bond forged in adversity, strengthened by mutual respect, and ignited by a passion that had long been suppressed. Alara, witnessing their blossoming love, was overjoyed. She had always sensed the connection between her brother and Isabel, and she had hoped that they would find their way to each other. She knew that Isabel was the woman who could bring light and warmth back into Gareth's life, the woman who could heal his wounded soul. Callan, too, proved to be a steadfast ally. He had risked his life to betray Alaric and to warn Gareth, and he continued to offer his loyalty and support. He was a skilled warrior and a knowledgeable guide, and he helped them to plan their next move. They knew they could not remain in the cave forever. The northern tribes were still a threat, and they needed to return to Northwick to rally their forces and prepare for a larger conflict. But Gareth was still too weak to travel, and they needed to be sure of a safe passage. One evening, as they sat around the fire, discussing their options, Callan made a suggestion. There is an old, abandoned watchtower, not far from here, he said. It is on a high vantage point, overlooking the main pass through the mountains. If we could reach it, we could signal Northwick, send a message for help. It was a risky plan. The watchtower was exposed, and they could be easily spotted by the enemy. But it was their best hope of contacting Northwick and securing a safe passage home. Gareth, though still weak, agreed.
We will do it, he said.
We will reach the watchtower and send a signal. They set out at dawn, moving stealthily through the forest, avoiding the main trails, sticking to the shadows. Gareth, though still in pain, walked with a determined stride, his hand never far from his sword. Isabel rode beside him, her own sword at her side, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. They reached the watchtower without incident. It was a crumbling stone structure, perched on a rocky outcrop, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. The wind howled around them, the cold biting at their exposed skin. Callan set about building a fire, using dry wood and tinder he had gathered along the way. They would use the smoke as a signal, hoping that someone at Northwick would see it and recognize it as a sign of distress. As the fire began to burn, sending a plume of smoke into the sky, they waited, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The minutes stretched into hours, and still there was no sign of response. Just as they were beginning to lose hope, they saw it. A distant flicker of light, an answering signal from the south. Northwick had seen their message. Help was on the way. But their relief was short-lived. As they watched the approaching signal, they heard the sound of approaching riders coming from the north. It was a large force of northern tribesmen, their faces painted with war paint, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. They had been spotted. The enemy was upon them. Gareth, despite his weakened state, drew his sword, his eyes hardening with resolve. We will fight, he said. We will hold them off until help arrives. Isabel, her heart pounding with fear, but her spirit undaunted, drew her own sword. We will fight together, she said. The battle was fierce and brutal. The tribesmen, fueled by their hatred and their lust for blood, attacked with a savage ferocity. Gareth, Isabel, Alara, and Callan, though outnumbered and outmatched, fought with courage and determination, defending the watchtower, protecting each other. As the fighting raged, Isabel saw a figure emerge from the ranks of the tribesmen, a tall, imposing warrior with a scarred face and a cruel smile. It was the leader of the tribes, the one who had orchestrated the ambush, the one who had wounded Gareth. Isabel felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for revenge. She broke away from the main fighting, her eyes fixed on the tribal leader, her sword raised. "You," she shouted, her voice ringing through the din of battle. "You will pay for what you have done." The tribal leader turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Isabel charging towards him. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You are but a woman," he sneered. "You are no match for me." "I am the Countess of Wessex," she retorted, her voice filled with fury. "And I will see you dead." They clashed swords, the steel ringing out in the cold mountain air. Isabel, though smaller and less experienced, fought with a ferocity born of grief and rage. She had trained with Gareth, learned from him, and she used every skill she had acquired. The tribal leader, though surprised by her skill, was still a formidable opponent. He was stronger, more experienced, and he fought with a savage brutality. But Isabel would not yield. She parried his blows, dodged his attacks, and struck back with a relentless determination. She was fighting for Gareth, for Alara, for her people, for her future. As they fought, the tide of the battle began to turn. The answering signal from Northwick had been seen by the approaching relief force, and they were now close, their war cries echoing through the mountains. The tribesmen, sensing that they were about to be overwhelmed, began to falter, their attack losing momentum. Isabel, seeing her opportunity, pressed her attack, her sword flashing in the sunlight. With a final, desperate lunge, she struck the tribal leader, her blade piercing his armor, drawing blood. He staggered back, his eyes widening in shock and pain. He looked at Isabel, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hatred. You have defeated me," he gasped, his voice weak. "Justice has been served," she said, her voice cold. He collapsed to the ground, his lifeblood staining the snow. The remaining tribesmen, seeing their leader fall, lost their will to fight. They scattered, fleeing back into the mountains, leaving behind their dead and wounded. The relief force from Northwick arrived, their banners flying, their swords raised. They cheered as they saw Gareth and Isabel, alive and victorious. The battle was over. The shadows of allegiance had shifted, and the balance of power had been restored. But the war was far from over. The northern tribes were still a threat, and the flames of rebellion still burned. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The return to Northwick was a triumphant, yet somber, affair. Gareth, though weakened by his wounds and the ordeal he had endured, was greeted as a hero. The people of Northwick cheered his return, their hearts filled with relief and gratitude. Isabel, too, was hailed as a heroine, her courage and determination in the face of adversity earning her the respect and admiration of all. But the victory was bittersweet. The losses they had suffered, the pain they had endured, cast a shadow over their celebrations. Gareth mourned the loss of his men, the brave warriors who had fallen in the ambush. Isabel grieved for Alara, for the shattered remnants of a past that could never be fully restored, and she grappled with the actions she had taken, the life she had ended on the cold mountain pass. In the days that followed, Gareth and Isabel worked together to rebuild, to heal, to prepare for the challenges that still lay ahead. Gareth, as Lord Warden of the Northern Marches, focused on strengthening the defenses of the North, forging alliances with neighboring lords, and preparing for a renewed conflict with the northern tribes. Isabel, as Countess of Wessex, oversaw the restoration of her own lands, ensuring the well-being of her people and working to establish a lasting peace. Their shared duties, their commitment to their people, drew them even closer. They relied on each other's counsel, supported each other's decisions, and found solace in each other's presence. Their love, once a whispered secret, a fragile hope, blossomed into a powerful force, a bond that could not be broken by duty, by obligation, or by the threat of war. One evening, as they stood together on the battlements of Northwick, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape, Gareth turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "Isabel," he said, his voice hoarse, "I have been a fool. I have spent my life bound by oaths, by duty, by the expectations of others. I have denied myself happiness. I have denied myself love. I have denied myself you." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I will not make that mistake again," he said. "I will not let duty, or obligation, or anything else, stand between us." He paused, then added, "Isabel, Countess of Wessex, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you share my life, my burdens, my triumphs, my future?" Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had finally found its expression. "Gareth," she whispered, her voice trembling, "there is nothing I want more. I love you, Gareth, with all my heart, with all my soul, and I will gladly be your wife." He drew her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He kissed her, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their vows, a kiss that spoke of a future filled with hope, with love, with shared purpose. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by nobles from across the realm, by the people of Northwick and Wessex, by all those who had witnessed their journey, who had shared in their struggles, who had celebrated their triumphs. King Edric himself presided over the ceremony, bestowing his blessing upon the union, acknowledging the strength and the wisdom of the couple who stood before him. Isabel, radiant in a gown of white silk and ermine, her hair adorned with winter roses, looked every bit the countess, the warrior, the woman who had overcome adversity and found her true love. Gareth, resplendent in his armor, his scars a testament to his courage and his resilience, looked every bit the lord, the protector, the man who had finally found his peace, his happiness, his home. As they exchanged their vows, their voices clear and strong, their eyes locked in a gaze of unwavering love, the assembled guests cheered, their hearts filled with joy and hope. The reckoning of love and duty had been achieved, a balance struck between the demands of their roles and the desires of their hearts. The feast that followed was a celebration of their union, a celebration of their strength, a celebration of their future. There was music, dancing, laughter, and the sharing of stories, of memories, of hopes for the days to come. As the evening drew to a close, Gareth and Isabel stood together, hand in hand, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The snow-covered hills, the dark forests, the distant mountains, all seemed to hold a promise of peace, of prosperity, of a future filled with love and happiness. "We have faced many challenges, my love," Gareth said, his voice soft. "And we will face many more. But we will face them together, as husband and wife, as partners, as equals." Together, Isabel echoed, her voice filled with conviction. "We will face them together. And we will prevail." Their love, forged in the crucible of adversity, tempered by the fires of rebellion, strengthened by the bonds of duty and honor, had finally found its expression, its fulfillment, its home. The winter night had found his warmth, and the lioness had found her peace. The reckoning was complete. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the ebb and flow of life at Northwick, and the steady growth of a love that defied the odds. Gareth and Isabel ruled wisely and justly, their combined strength and wisdom bringing peace and prosperity to the north. The threat from the northern tribes, though never entirely extinguished, was contained, their raids less frequent, their power diminished. Gareth, as Lord Warden, proved to be a formidable leader, his military prowess matched by his diplomatic skills. He forged alliances, negotiated treaties, and ensured the security of the border, earning the respect and loyalty of his people and the grudging admiration of his enemies. Isabel, as Countess, proved to be an equally capable ruler. She managed her lands with wisdom and compassion, promoting trade, encouraging agriculture, and fostering a sense of community among her people. She also remained a close advisor to Gareth, her knowledge of the court and her understanding of political intrigue proving invaluable. Their marriage, a union forged in adversity, blossomed into a partnership of equals, a testament to their shared values, their mutual respect, and their unwavering love. They faced challenges together, celebrated triumphs together, and mourned losses together. They built a life, a family, a legacy. Children came, bringing joy and laughter to the halls of Northwick. A son, strong and courageous, named Edric, after the king who had blessed their union. A daughter, beautiful and intelligent, named Alara, in memory of the cousin Isabel had lost. And another son, gentle and compassionate, named Edmund, after Isabel's first husband. The scars of the past, though they never fully faded, became reminders of the strength they had found in each other, of the battles they had fought, of the love that had sustained them. Gareth's physical scars, the marks of his battles, were a testament to his courage and his resilience. Isabel's emotional scars, the wounds of betrayal and loss, were a reminder of the pain she had overcome, of the strength she had discovered within herself. As the years went by, Gareth and Isabel often found themselves standing on the battlements of Northwick, gazing out at the landscape that had become their home, their kingdom, their legacy. The snow-covered hills, the dark forests, the distant mountains, all held a beauty that was both stark and comforting, a reflection of the life they had built together. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape, Gareth turned to Isabel, his hand reaching out to take hers. His hair was streaked with silver, his face lined with the marks of time, but his eyes still held the same spark of love, the same unwavering devotion that had captured her heart so many years ago. "We have built a good life, my love," he said, his voice soft. "A life filled with purpose, with love, with happiness." Isabel smiled, her own hair touched with silver, her face bearing the gentle marks of time, but her eyes still shining with the same love, the same unwavering devotion that had drawn him to her so long ago. "We have," she agreed, "a life beyond my wildest dreams. A life I would not trade for anything." They stood there, hand in hand, their bodies close, their hearts intertwined, their souls united. The wind whispered through the battlements, carrying with it the echoes of the past, the whispers of the future, the promise of a love that would endure, a love that had conquered all. And in the twilight, as the stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky, they knew that their journey, though marked by trials and tribulations, had been worth it. They had found their home, their peace, their happiness in each other's arms. Their story, begun in the heart of a brutal winter storm, found resolution in the warmth of an enduring love. The end.